Hello and welcome back to another week of the War Report. Week 65, actually more like week 68. Took a couple weeks off in November, but that is aside the point. We have plenty of news topics to get into today. Just me and Perseus. GSP, of course, has been recalled back to Moscow yet again. It happens more often than you think, but let's just get right into the news topics, starting with some news out of the, you guessed it, Persian Gulf. So, the US and UK are struggling to form a coalition to police the Strait of Hormuz after a series of oil tankers have been seized by Iranian forces. Now, several European and Middle Eastern nations and Japan have declined to aid the UK and US after, of course, the Iranians seized two tankers. Now, the Daily Mail reports that the first two UK casualties that occurred in
Wait
Syria.
one sec. Yeah, one sec. That's another report. So just real quickly, let's just touch on the tankers. So yeah, right now the US and UK are actually having a hard time getting anyone to agree to police the Strait of Hormuz. And what that means is that basically IRGC speed vessels are just flying around. And the UK has brought in some warships to just kind of like to try to make a threat, but the thing is that it's not really working, especially because one, it's costly to do this type of policing, and so that's why Trump has been wanting other countries to take part in it. And the other part is that Trump has had this sort of approach with international partners, whether NATO or what have you, that they need to pay more. I mean, this was something that he kept saying when he was running for office that NATO isn't paying enough. We're doing this for them and they're not paying. And this was a point of contention between Trump and Merkel as well. Trump had felt that Germany was not paying its fair share, and so Trump has sort of is reigniting this issue with Europe, with the Strait of Hormuz, saying that, look, we're the only ones policing it right now. And the UK taking part in this and trying to ask the European partners to help out while simultaneously announcing Brexit, which we'll touch on later. But this is just rubbing the Europeans the wrong way. And so right now, what Iran has been able to do is they've sort of taken advantage of the situation. They've cozied up with the Europe with the JCPOA, and they've cozied up with the UAE, the United Arab Emirates, who is across the strait from Iran. Now, typically, these Gulf Arab states are lock in step with one another. Qatar, Oman, Saudi, UAE. They usually they just follow each other, but in due to the recent events in the Strait of Hormuz, the UAE seems to have switched sides. In They've engaged in secret meetings with Iran, and the outcome of those meetings is that the UAE is going to help Iran police the Strait of Hormuz. So right now, Trump is sort of losing partners in the Persian Gulf while Iran is gaining one. And so that's where we're at right now with the Strait of Hormuz.
Now, it's interesting that you bring up both those points because, as you said, previously for decades, pretty much since the Cold War, the Gulf states have acted as a singular unit following each other's lead, whether that be, again, Saudi Arabia, Qatar, the UAE, whatever. Now, we, of course, saw this around 2016, 2017, that Qatar sort of tried to lean towards the Iranian side and began opening up talks with them. And now we're seeing the UAE do the same. And I know Jordan isn't really a Gulf state, but they've seen themselves become a mediator between the various sides of the various conflicts in this war. And you could also say the same about Oman. So it's interesting how we're seeing Saudi Arabia really become more and more isolated from the rest of the region. And the other point I wanted to make about what you said is Trump and his complaining to Europe, to NATO, demanding they pay more, do their fair share, do their part to uphold the alliance. It's interesting because in 2016, during the election, Trump billed himself, of course, as the anti-imperial candidate. Now we all see how that turned out. But billing himself as the anti-imperial America First candidate, it made sense. We shouldn't have to pay for you. We should not have to provide for you. But then when he gets in office, he keeps that rhetoric, he keeps that populist rhetoric, but still wants to function as the head of the empire and issue commands and tell other countries, tell our allied countries how they have to function, while at the same time pulling back funds and demanding they pay more. He wants the best of both worlds, and I've touched on this many times before, but this case is, I would say, sort of the epitome of how Trump has acted in regards to this.
Yeah, I think Trump is has used NATO's, the various European countries' non-payment to NATO or their lack of participation more as a bargaining chip to try to get Europe to do what it wants on other grounds, such as trade. And so you're right that Trump is still trying to hold this, this jockey, this top position while saying these other people aren't doing their fair share, but he's doing it to get them to do what he wants in other areas. So by pressuring Europe, his goal was initially to get the Europeans to drop out of the JCPOA. And this has essentially backfired on Trump. That the more he's been trying to push the Europeans in his direction, he's been pushing them away. And that's what happened in the meeting in Vienna this last week between the European partners and Iran. The European partners stressed that they're not able to work with Trump. And because of that, they're going to try to again maintain their portion of the JCPOA. And so and Iran did describe the meeting as constructive afterwards. I mean, this is kind of rare because typically when Europe and Iran meets, Iran always issues a public statement that they're not doing enough. But this was one of the rare developments in that you're just seeing the further tension growing between Trump and Europe.
Yeah, I would definitely agree, and most people would think, oh, it's just between Trump and the neoliberal establishment of Europe, such as Merkel and Macron. But you're seeing more and more as it comes to the populist side of Europe, where you see with figures like Orban. I know Hungary isn't that much of a major player in Europe, but the point stands. But the populist countries, the populist governments, are starting to look at their bottom line, look at their own interests, and seeing deals with Iran and staying friendlier with the broad European Union, more so trying to take it over from the inside, and of course, cooperation with Russia as more appealing than cooperation with Trump, who was supposed to be the global populist figurehead of the Western world. As at least that was how it was billed when he was first elected. So it's interesting to see how it's almost unanimous in Europe, aside from a few holdouts, of course, the UK and a few factions in a few countries, that yeah, things are becoming very strained with the US, and deals with Iran and by extension deals with Russia are looking more and more appealing to them.
Yeah, and Russia and Iran, I mean, ideology aside, to the Europeans, Russia and Iran serve material benefit in terms of trade for oil and gas. It's much cheaper and closer, and in terms of military, in terms of keeping terrorists at bay. And so you are right that it is both the left and the right in Europe that are kind of seeing the Trump's hostility toward trade with Russia or Iran as kind of unnecessary. All right, so let me just finish up this Daily Mail report on this region and we can move on. So the Daily Mail in UK that reported that the first two casualties that had occurred of British soldiers in Syria was not in fact due to an ISIS attack or an ISIS IED, which it was originally reported as. It turns out that according to investigative journalists, this was actually the death by friendly fire, that the first two British soldiers who died in Syria actually died of friendly fire. And so this is sort of unraveling into a major issue in the sense that one, uh, military deaths are not being reported accurately, and this is a problem to especially like the family members of the soldiers, who have believed for the last 2 years that their loved ones were killed by an ISIS soldier. And the second thing this reveals is how the media used their deaths to sort of galvanize British support for the war. And so this is just ultimately a lot of yellow journalism going on presently. and it's sad to see how a lot of the family members of these British soldiers are getting caught up in this terrible mess. Um, but yeah, that I wanted to point that out. It's just to bring it. There's not much to discuss. It's just tragic that this type of yellow journalism still exists. Now, just to close up the Middle East on the American side, let's talk about the congressional vote last week, the veto on the Saudi arms bill.
Yeah, I also have some stuff on the S-400s, but we can cover that first. So,
Sure, go ahead.
on July 24th, the Senate Foreign Relations Committee had a debate on how to pressure Riyadh regarding the death of journalist Jamal Khashoggi and Saudi involvement in the war in Yemen. The bill was ultimately voted on, which was which blocked any more weapon sales by the U.S. to Saudi Arabia. Now, despite passing, Trump vetoed this bill, a third time since similar ones were passed last year. Now, the Senate was unable to override the bill, and it's interesting. We've seen as these vetoes have gone on, it becomes a narrower and narrower margin where it's only a few votes that the veto isn't being overridden. Now, as to why Trump is so friendly with Saudi Arabia on this issue, especially compared to his campaign rhetoric, where he outright said Saudi involvement was the primary reason for 9/11, I would hazard a guess to say, number one, of course, internal political pressures. We must support Saudi Arabia against the Iranian menace. We must preserve stability in the region, all the tripe that they usually throw at us. But I would also say that I think Trump is trying to curry favor with OPEC. And, of course, if you want to make gains with OPEC, you have to go through mainly Saudi Arabia. Of course, they don't have a unilateral power, but it's pretty much universally agreed upon they're the most powerful member of the alliance. And my take on the situation is that he's cozying up to the Saudis in order to lean on them to try to lower the oil price.
Yeah, I mean, whatever it is, Trump is clearly in bed with Mohammed bin Salman. They are a major weapons purchaser, which helps the various defense companies that are backing Trump and various other politicians. So that clearly is part of the angle. But what is more interesting to me too is that this this was vetoed by Trump basically in the same week that the anti-BDS bill was voted on as well, in which it was, it ended on the Israeli side. My point being with the two is that Washington, in basically in a 1 week span, has reaffirmed and has blatantly affirmed its allegiance to Israel, Saudi Arabia, and and it's not because they don't know what's going on. The Senate Foreign Relations Committee did have a heated debate. I mean, the atrocities that Saudi Arabia is committing in Yemen is like it's not like it's not known. They know what's going on. That's why this debate is occurring. But at the same time, it's clear that not even the elected officials of the American people can have much of a say on the Saudi regime's brutality. And so there's this funny sort of argument against the anti-BDS bill that was being thrown around by people like Jake Tapper of CNN. He had mentioned like, well, why don't they go after Saudi? Why won't they do something about Saudi? Well, here you have a bill where it would affect Saudi and it still gets vetoed. And so it's clear that this is sort of it is a trap to get to help a particular coalition.
Yeah, one of my favorite talking points or tactics of the pro-Zionist crowd, at least in the West, mainly the Anglosphere, mainly the United States, is whenever you criticize Israel, they're like, "Why don't you criticize Saudi Arabia?" Failing to realize the fact that, especially in recent years, especially under Trump, they have become such a singular unit in so many facets, so many things that they do on so many different conflicts and agreements they have, of course, behind closed doors, that criticism of one is almost at this point a criticism of the other.
Absolutely. Israel takes this chaos strategy in the region where basically if you don't have if you're not fully integrated militarily and economically with it, you're basically going to feel the plague. And so this is what happened to countries like Syria, where Assad refused to fully integrate with Israel, refused to recognize them as a legitimate state, and now they're experiencing the chaos strategy. Now, Saudi Arabia, in turn, now they're building stadiums, they're opening up their first nightclub. Saudi Arabia is toting the Israeli line, and so you can see that, they are fully integrated. Absolutely.
Now, our last story for the region, I wanted to get into a bit of interesting news about, of course, the S-400 deals. Now, this is from Sputnik, the Russian news outlet, and the headline is, quote, Trump says he doesn't blame Turkey for purchasing Russian S-400 missile defense systems. It is quite Trumpian the way this played out. He was like, "Oh, I don't blame Turkey. I don't blame Erdogan for buying these missile defense systems, but we can't tolerate it. We still need to put the sanctions on. And those F-35s we're going to give you, we can sell them to anyone else." He, of course, went on his typical spiel that he'll do on these kinds of situations, but he is the only other country I really see him do this to at least this degree with. He does it to pretty much every country he deals with. Is Russia? For example, he was saying earlier this week, we've never had worse relations with Russia, and there's no reason we shouldn't be friends with them." Now, whenever he says anything like that, something almost always happens to tank U.S.-Russian relations even further, and that's more of a side note. That's something I just find a bit odd. No, nothing going on behind the scenes there, but the main focus, of course, is Trump is really playing this devil talk where he doesn't want to isolate Turkey, yet he's being pressured to punish them for buying the S-400s. And again, it goes back to our absent friend GSP saying Trump's foreign policy is one of schizophrenia.
Yeah, absolutely. Now, in terms of Erdogan, he's a wild man. There were there were those rumors that he had died of a heart attack, but then he came out publicly and made statements against Israel. So it's been kind of a wild few weeks for Erdogan, but he is appearing to side more with the Iran-Russia side of things, despite maintaining the northern part of Syria away from Assad. It seems like the relations between Turkey and America are getting extremely sour right now. And so, as long as Erdogan remains in power, I don't see that uh, getting necessarily better. But in terms of what was your other point? I forgot.
Whenever,
No, the Russia
yeah,
thing.
yeah.
So yeah, so Trump is clearly taking cues from John Bolton. Whenever I see the explicitly anti-Russian rhetoric, and especially the anti-Iranian rhetoric, you have to acknowledge that this is John Bolton talking. Because I mean, remember 2016, Trump was talking about friendlier relations with Russia. Why are we enemies with Russia? But now, with John Bolton in the office, he has a clear hostility toward Russia, and we know that he is sort of parroting past lines of Bolton through that tweet he had of Iran just
That
yesterday. The one where he's like, "Oh, Iran has never won a war, but they've never lost a negotiation." That line is actually a direct quote from an article, an op-ed written by John Bolton in 2017, in which he wrote those exact words. Not the exclamation point. That was a little bit of Trump's, little
Wait,
pizzazz that he added.
was that from the same article where he said to stop Iran we need to bomb Iran?
Probably. I'm not sure. I'm sure it's along those lines. I mean, Bolton he's been out of office for many years. So all he had been doing was just like he was just a Washington Post mouthpiece for so long.
Yeah, he was just
And
hobnobbing around with the think tanks and all the different organizations, the media outlets. Yeah, I mean, his political career is very unimpressive, aside from his brief appointment as ambassador in the tail years of Bush and his recent appointment as national security advisor for the past year and a few months here. But other than that, again, Tucker Carlson said it best. He's a bureaucratic tapeworm in the bowels of Washington.
oh yeah, absolutely. And it to me, it's kind of fascinating that Trump actually directly quoted Bolton without attributing it to him. Obviously he wanted that point to be made, but at the same time, the quote is just factually wrong on its on its face, but we don't need to get into that. But it's clearly a quote that's meant to antagonize. It's not, and I mean, and this isn't this show's topic area, but I mean, it kind of falls in line with his sort of Baltimore tweets and the tweets at the four congressmen to go back. There is this sort of like furry in the Republican Party to try to gin up racial animosity, white racial animosity toward non-Jews. I mean, it's clearly what is going on right now.
Yeah, it's interesting because just on that note, not to go off too much of a tangent, but Trump, the Republican Party, and strategy is they realize there's the racial tensions they can exploit, but you can tell like during the sender back chance a couple weeks back, immediately he pivoted to the fact, oh, we have to stand up against their anti-Semitism rather than all the other egregious anti-white and just anti-American things that people have said. We have to focus on the fact that they were mean to the state of Israel.
It's so funny when the topic of racism comes up. When it's the right addressing it, they're always bringing up anti-Semitism, right? But like, think back to 2016 when Hillary Clinton was addressing the alt-right, she never brought up anti-Semitism. She always talked about the alt-right being anti-Muslim, anti-woman, anti-black. It was never the anti-Semitism was not the left's sort of hinge point on why the alt-right was bad. So it's kind of funny to see how each side exploit that term in different ways. All
Yeah.
right, so now
Boris
should we
Brexit
move
is
on
what.
to North?
It,
Oh
it,
yeah, let's do that.
yeah, just some European news. So, as we announced last week, Boris Johnson is officially the Prime Minister of the United Kingdom, and his first week in office hasn't really been too eventful aside from a bit of media outrage for the first few days. But he has affirmed that the UK will be out of the European Union come October 31st. Yeah, of course, spooky Halloween. You ask some of the Remainers there, they'd probably say it's a. But you get my point. But I do have to say, Boris Johnson, despite all his faults, now he was coming out and having some drivel on amnesty and being pretty weak-willed on immigration, if you ask me, and other issues, being very liberal, very neoliberal, if you will. I do think he will stick to the Brexit deadline at the very least. So I have confidence on him in that one issue. Other than that, absolutely not.
Yeah, so right now the main issue between Boris Johnson and the EU appears as to whether the breakups can involve a deal. The EU is sort of saying that if this is going to happen, what do we get out of it? And so Boris Johnson right now is trying to get the EU to scrap some aspects of their dealings with the British in trade to avoid a no-deal Brexit. And so that from the EU side, this is just another thorn in their side from the British. On the one hand, they want military support, then they want to leave Brexit, but they need the EU to make certain concessions. And so they're not seeing the British as playing fairly. That's why the EU is trying to engage in a deal in order for Brexit to happen. But right now, I mean, Boris Johnson is saying it's going to happen. Now, whether a deal will be in place or not, um, that remains to be seen. But if it's not, you can assure that that's going to bode well for Iran.
Oh, absolutely. Now, just on that, I've noticed, especially in these Brexit negotiations immediately after the vote, there's been this mentality, at least in the British ruling class, even from the more globalistic ones, from the more I would say it's purely anti-EU, pro-Brexit camp mentality. Maybe spreads into a little bit of the Remain camp, but my point is, they still have this mentality that they are at the seat of the empire on which the sun never sets. They still think they're the British Empire, and they still think they have the influence of the British Empire going into their negotiations with Europe. And it's been a rude awakening for them that they are not the British Empire, that India is independent, Canada, Australia, no sway on them over culture, and of course the ceremonial monarch. But it's almost as if the ruling class in the UK doesn't realize the fact that, yeah, you control this island, you do not control a quarter of the world's land anymore.
Yeah, I mean that is the issue, but England does wield a sort of economic weight that the EU does not have. I mean, the pound is an extremely powerful currency.
Oh,
And
absolutely.
so I mean, this is the sort of sack that Johnson is sort of waving at the EU right now. And this is why the EU is desperate for a deal. But the problem is, Boris Johnson does not appear to have any sort of proposal in mind. He's just aiming for the 31st, a spooky Halloween Brexit.
Now, moving on to a little bit more European news. There is more news about, of course, good old Jeffrey Epstein and Deutsche Bank, as we were discussing last week. Now, investigators are looking into a connection between Deutsche Bank holding money and bank accounts for Epstein after J.P. Morgan previously declined to hold his money. Now, there, go on.
Yeah, I mean, this is just. I think that what this reveals is just sort of the scale of the Epstein matter. This isn't a criminal investigation in Florida and New York. Clearly, this is some international operation that's going on. And Deutsche Bank is already, as we discussed last week, I mean, there's already enough issues on their plate. And, this sort of revealment is probably going to be devastating. Now, hopefully, one would hope, because JP Morgan, they sort of anticipated potential financial or legal issues in holding this Epstein money. You got to remember, legally, no one knows where Epstein's money came from. Theoretically, it probably came from a foreign state. So holding that money is was you got to understand it was probably really difficult. And so Deutsche Bank took a gamble, and they must have prospered holding a billionaire's money, but now they're looking into that.
Yeah, absolutely. And, as you were saying, this has to be some sort of international spy ring, whether it's tied to not so governmental organizations or whether it's tied to governments. The main one, of course, people would say with Epstein is the Mossad, Israel. Hell, could have CIA ties, MI6. Name any intelligence agencies. For all we know, it could be the Russians who are behind something for once. But I doubt that one. But it is interesting that um,
Um,
the narrative in most people's mind is a creepy rich white guy is the narrative in the public mind, or at least the media class. Uh, did terrible things to young women on this island. Let's not mention the fact that all the women were happened to be white and usually like that's in some cases prepubescent, but again, that's aside the point. And that they are trying very hard, and they're succeeding to cover up his ties to foreign intelligence, government officials, and again now Deutsche Bank, one of the largest banks in the world. So beyond that chaos, let's move on to some news out of East Asia, particularly North Korea.
all right. So, yeah, North Korea, they've been engaging in some missile testing. This is all after the various summits, Trump crossing the border and looking at some dirt on the North Korean side. Despite these shows of peace, North Korea has been pretty active in the missile testing side of things. Now, in the last 3 days, there were two tests. One test was a set of projectiles, which is um, most likely it's being described as nuclear weapons testing. And the second series of testing, which was today, is believed to be from submarines launching missiles. And so, what this essentially shows is North Korea is not in any way, restricted by whatever discussions they're having with Trump. Whatever. If you remember last year, people thought that Trump was going to get North Korea to disarm. We were telling everyone from the get go that would never freaking happen, right? And so now we're just sort of seeing the proof of that. That despite their meetings, despite Trump's shows of peace, Kim still is sort of running the show, so to speak. And this does sort of put Trump in a whack-a-mole position where each time he thinks he has one situation handled, whether Russia, Iran, Venezuela, China, Turkey, North Korea, it almost seems like they all pop up at different times immediately after another to sort of ease the burden off all of them simultaneously. And you can kind of you get that feeling because in the last week just so much has happened in terms of Russia Turkey S-400 sales. Then you have the North Korea weapons test. Then you have an Iranian weapons test, which was happening in its border, which isn't even something to report, but still the fact that the AP is taking the time to report this means it means something to them, whether propaganda or factual, whatever. It means something to them. Then we had the Chinese military buildup, and then another set of weapons testing by North Korea. So there's a
And
lot
of
on Trump's
course,
plate.
we haven't gotten into this, but the Israeli missile tests in Alaska,
Yeah, yeah, yeah. I forgot about that.
which we will get into shortly. Believe me, but beyond that, it's just been a week of weapons tests, and I think I just got the show title right now. But moving on from that, I mean the
Yeah, I mean it really has been. I mean even with the Alaskan one, we're going from weapons tests from Iran to North Korea to Hyperborea. Everyone has weapons to test.
just make sure Sealand doesn't get on it because that case, oh boy. But um, of course North Korea. Trump has had his successes. Trump has had his failures. A lot of that could be attributed to Mike Pompeo and John Bolton, which is on a side note. We haven't heard much from Pompeo lately, come to think of it, but again, that's aside the point. Now, I can only imagine North Korea is doing these missile tests. Number one is reaction to Trump's just broad Iran policy over the past few months here. Or something else we have to consider is the fact that there were annual military drills. They weren't entirely called off, so it could just be a shows of force on both sides. And I haven't seen any major news out of it, but there could be an impasse between North Korea and China right now. And of course, North Korea and Japan are not a good term, so I wouldn't make too much of it. And one theory I've heard, I don't necessarily agree with, but I'll put out here that somebody proposed this actually a few months back that North Korea would begin becoming more aggressive and more belligerent with its tests if they thought Trump's electoral chances were going down. Because again, the new administration, of course, new set of challenges. Now, I don't personally buy into that, but I think it's an interesting theory nonetheless. But beyond that, unless you have any further comments, I'll cover a
Yeah,
little bit
no,
on
no,
Hong Kong.
you're totally right in that there does seem to be this sort of consensus among various world leaders, whether Europe, Iran, or North Korea, that Trump isn't going to last. And I think this has a lot to do with the media coverage, obviously. I mean, this was sort of the reason why he won in 2016. But my point being is that there is this sort of feeling amongst various world leaders that Trump will be a one-term president, and whether it's going to happen, we don't know. It's perhaps they could be totally wrong too, but this is a calculus they are taking.
Now,
I mean,
yeah,
with Obama, they would have never done this. I mean, think about that.
yeah,
How they would have never questioned Obama being reelected. Not even Bush, really. The fact that they're questioning Trump's ability to reelect probably shows more of the instability domestically in the U.S.
well,
than it does
I
any.
mean, Bush and Obama both had great wins, in their sales. I mean, Bush had 9/11 and Obama had Romney. Put up any other Republican, even Newt Gingrich at that point. And Obama probably would have been a one-termer, but with that out of the way, things are much more unstable for Trump domestically, worldwide, just in any facet. Of course, I know the doomsdayers always do this, but who knows what direction the economy will go in the next year. It could just completely fall out. We could go into another recession. We don't know. But with that being said, just briefly, the protests do continue in Hong Kong. Now, as I've laid out before, people have been, I would say, fear mongering a bit. Like they've been showing PLA trucks driving through Hong Kong streets. The PLA has been there for a good amount of time now. It doesn't necessarily mean invasion, but I do have to say it likely is the end of Hong Kong as we know it. It will likely be incorporated into China proper over the coming years. And as the United States, as the entire Western world has expressed, that Hong Kong has served its purpose from the more, I would say, capitalistic perspective of being that spearhead that pushes big business into China, especially as relations started to open throughout the 70s, 80s, 90s. But as I said previously, they will draw the line at Taiwan, hence the recent arms deals. And I would say that just not even any Chinese actions on Hong Kong. Now, of course, they've come out and for the first time actually spoken out against the protests of the government in Beijing. But I would say just the situation in general, just because of what the people of Hong Kong are doing, is what prompted Trump to actually go forward with the weapons deal, which I am opposed to. I laid out the fact that I think we just gave a bargaining chip by actually going through with it. But I imagine we'll have more to say about that in the coming weeks and months. But beyond that, I don't expect Hong Kong to be a flashpoint of any kind. I mean, if you're to believe what's been leaked, what's been said behind closed doors, is that the United States doesn't care about Hong Kong. We're actually willing to let it slide in order to reach a trade agreement with China. So it's an interesting situation nonetheless, but I don't think it is what most people are making out to be.
Yeah, China is actually accusing the CIA of fostering those protests. Now, the protests are kind of a hodgepodge of things. I mean, you have like Christians, LGBT, democracy. It does sort of have the feelings of the color revolutions and Arab Spring and even like an Occupy Wall Street sort of thing in the sense that it is a sort of a weird coalition of sort of I guess marginalized people. I mean, really, that's just
Yeah, I would
a
definitely
way to
agree
put
that
it.
it glows in the dark for those of you who understand that reference, but I would say out of all the color revolutions, out of all the contrived movements we've seen over the past 2 decades, this one seems the most legitimate. Now, as far as Hong Kong goes, as I said, I really don't care. I couldn't care less if Hong Kong remains as an autonomous city state, becomes part of the British Empire again for all we care, or is incorporated in the China proper. Again, I see no effect on American security or American sovereignty or American even economic prospects. But
I mean, there were reports that the Buddhists were engaging in like a drug trade, almost like Buddhist monks, and so like it's not to say, and even engaging in like really weird sexual acts. I mean, a lot of this was captured by Chinese authorities when they would arrest these officials. Now, whether it's true or not, I don't know. But my point being is that um, even the elements that you wouldn't think would act Western in these sort of protests do, and that's when the question sort of comes up is whether there is international involvement.
yeah, I would say there definitely is. There always is. But I would actually say these are spurned on. I would say they're pretty grassroots. Over the past century of Hong Kong's under the British and being an autonomous city, they have cultivated their own unique identity separate from that of China proper, I would say. But yeah, I would definitely say, yeah, it glows in the dark. It reeks of foreign fingerprints. But beyond that, I think its initial, like its genesis, was probably a lot more legitimate than it is today. But at the end of the day, again, I think people are making a mountain out of a molehill in this. And unless you have any further comments on the subject, I would like to move on.
No, I'm good.
So let's get into a little bit on the U.S. Mexican border,
Wait,
and
wait. Actually, let's finish up. Let's just finish up the Israeli
yeah,
weapons
yeah, yeah.
testing. So it is kind of weird. What it was is that the Israel was testing out a new missile defense system. Now, the first question that comes to mind is why the hell are they not testing this in Israel or heck, even the Golan Heights or where what have you? Instead, it was tested in Alaska. Now, it could be that that's where it was developed or what have you. I'm sure there's a million logistical explanations for this, but at the same time, it is pretty curious. I feel like in the end, a missile defense system like this, especially showing it off at Alaska, I think it was not so much of a sign um, to Israel's enemies per se, but more so a sort of show of force, perhaps maybe even to Russia. Remember, Sarah Palin could see Russia from her backyard. but but no, but really, my point being is that this type of missile defense system is not necessarily needed where Israel is, right? So what I'm saying is, its testing in Alaska may be more related to Russia as opposed to Iran or any of the other territorial
And of
pro-
course,
the
we all know Israel and Russia have their own little tango going on in the region, so it's no surprise that make it taken to Alaska for Israel to test. Of course, yeah, they have their own little measuring contest going on with the Russians, as I just said.
hmm No, for sure, and it could just very well be that's just where it's developed, or it's easier to do. Sure, sure, I accept these rational explanations, but it also, with the nuclear bombings of Nagasaki and Hiroshima, these were done to show the Soviet Union what the U.S. was capable of, and the driving force between U.S. Russian hostilities is Israel. I mean, 100%. It's the reason why Russia cannot get trade deals with the EU, or what have you. And so, uh, in that regard, I do think one, it may have been a message to Russia, and also just how far north it was in Alaska. Maybe there's just some sort of weird, symbolic thing, shooting Israeli missiles into the Hyperborean skies. I don't know. Maybe there's something weird with the dates. Someone can check the dates. Maybe there's something
Some
to the
esoteric,
numerology.
esoteric
Yeah,
occulting.
yeah,
Yeah, I
yeah. It was very far north. It was very far north.
now what I find funniest out of this story is, for decades, the neocons and the Zionists have told us, well, we support Israel and we give them so many weapons because it's like a testing ground. It's like a little playground to see how U.S. military equipment works over there. And it just comes out the fact that it's the exact opposite. We fund and protect Israel and we give them so much only for them to test their weapons over here. So yeah, I feel like this is a bit of a role reversal, and it is slightly uncomfortable the fact that we're supposed to be the global superpower, the sole superpower, the Washington runs the world, yet we're having foreign weapons tested on our soil. I don't know, it just rubs me the wrong way, and I say that seriously.
Yeah, definitely. I don't think U.S. is any position to call out anyone else's weapons testing when they're allowing a foreign country to test weapons on its soil.
I mean that would be like not entirely accurate analogy, but it's like if North Korean weapons testing were happening in China. It just feels wrong. Something's out of place, and I hope to hear more about the story, but I know for a fact that we won't. I know for a fact that it will be swept under the rug by the time the show premieres tomorrow. But beyond that, it's just odd.
Yeah, absolutely, absolutely.
Now let us close out the show with some little bit of blackpilling news. So this is a little bit of an older story. I saw this going around. Now, 2 dozen U.S. Marines were arrested and questioned in human smuggling and drug probes in California. And you check the names of these Marines. I remember when this article was initially going around from the Hill. They're what you would expect. They were Spanish last names, so Again, you can see the further degradation of our empire as it grows more diverse. People siding with their co-ethnics over their so-called nationality. But eh, I'm not
Mhm.
surprised, not happy either. But it's to be expected at this point.
Yeah, I mean, I think the main takeaway from this is, like you said, like the when you engage in a conscription style army where you're giving essentially citizenship to people who will serve in the military, you're not necessarily getting loyal people as they would probably think they would. And so, and this is sort of terrible because what happens is that a lot of these people essentially get weapons and military training, and then when they're out of the military, then what?
They work for
A
some
lot
third
of
world
them end up
dictator or
going,
cartel.
yeah, that, or they end up joining some gang in some LA barrio or what have you, wreaking havoc on some innocent people here. So it does show the problems of a conscription army. Just trying to enlist anyone and everyone to maintain the empire is just frankly not feasible for the empire internally. Because this is just, I mean, they're accused of human smuggling, drug smuggling. I mean, the human smuggling is clearly going to be sex trafficking,
Any arms smuggling
and
charges?
or cheap labor. That wasn't one of the charges, but I mean, you can only imagine what this is probably what they got caught with.
Oh yeah, absolutely.
And so, and the border, and you got to think about how ballsy of a move that is too, because I mean, even though the U.S. does have a pretty open border, I mean, it's still regularly observed and tracked. They just don't necessarily police and enforce it. So I mean, this was an internal operation. I mean, you're talking about 2 dozen people. Because think about it, they have powerful lasers. Literally, they have these lasers that shoot across the border so that if someone crosses the border, they can still track it. So they are tracking. I mean, think about the number of census that come out in terms of how many people are migrating. These are government officials who are tracking migration. So it's not that they don't know who's coming across or what have you. It's that they're not policing it, and the fact that there are people in these agencies that can now exploit it. It just, I'm sure there's probably far more criminal activity going on than
Yeah.
just these 2 dozen. That's 24 Marines. That's 24 that were caught.
And this is under. This is. I mean, you could probably slap um, the year 2014 on this article and tell a bunch of standard conservatives that look at how lax Obama was on immigration. And then you hit them with the fact that Trump, it was under the Trump administration, they're not going to believe you. They're going to laugh at you. And just to get onto a broader situation of the border, Trump, the political situation of the internally the United States in general, what Trump has done is he has lulled the conservatives, the populists, into this false sense of security, thinking, we're winning, we're going to make America great again, we're really standing up to all those illegal immigrants on the border. He's pacified the right while radicalizing the left. I mean, of course, you see, like, yeah, like I don't put too much stock in Portland Antifa, but point being is, they're mad that a Republican is the White House because Trump said mean things on Twitter, is what it boils down to. But it's maddening the fact that, look, I would have been shocked by this story under Obama. That's, I would say, the scale it's on. I would have been shocked on the story under a weak border Republican like Bush. But the fact that this is happening under our tough on immigration, tough on crime president is mind boggling to me.
Hmm. I mean, Trump of all presidents should at least take a harder stance on the conscription army. I mean, I
Have you
don't
even heard him talk
think.
about this situation? This seems like a story he would have been all over on Twitter, saying, talking about disloyalty in the military. But no, he has not said a word about this. No press release, nothing on Twitter, nothing.
Mhm. And it's a double-edged sword too, because not only are they getting citizenship, but they're also getting military training on the streets.
I mean, again, I say this all the time, but this is some late stage Empire stuff right here. This is like this is like Fall of Rome level. Like, I'm glad we let all these Germanic tribesmen fight for us in our imperial wars. I'm sure they'll assimilate just fine and not use any of their training and skills and experience against our empire. It's all you can do at this point is just laugh at it.
And it's not like that similar of a situation, but do recall
Yes, yes, I
the
understand.
the
I
BLM
exaggerate.
shooting. No. But no,
Yeah,
my point being is recall the Black Lives Matter shooting in Dallas, in which it was a former military who uses his skills to kill police officers, to murder police officers, and so I mean, there is a realistic threat that people can use their skills when they come home. Now, knowing that, they should be more cautious as to who they allow to serve. And I mean, giving citizenship outs to Central American, South American individuals, I don't know if that's going to be the best route.
yeah. I think it's pretty much anyone who can just has a basic grasp on English, meets the physical requirements, can enlist in the U.S. military and go fight in our foreign wars for citizenship. But it's interesting that you bring that up. Like, yeah, we should be more careful who we give the military training to. You'll get these stories every once in a while. It's like, oh, look at these white nationalists or white supremacists who came out of the military and with their military training, they're dangerous militants. Yet, at the worst, it's just a bunch of old Gen Xers and Boomers who sometimes have like the white identity symbol and do some parades every once in a while. Maybe in the yearly parade, but uh, that is focused on over the story that we just discussed.
I mean, think about the number of LA gangbangers who've been caught, who are former military or what have you, just go unreported for the crimes they commit. So it's just clearly just very lopsided and terrible.
Well, I would hate to leave you all on such a negative note, but that's just the way it is. It's not always fun, but yeah, it's just this the absolute state of our empire. Not only are we having our sovereignty violated by foreign missile tests, but also by the people who are supposedly signing up to fight for this country. Now, again, I don't know too much on the details. I imagine more, hopefully, more will come out at least, even if it's just an alternative media. Whether these were American Hispanics or whether they were foreigners we recruited in the military. But unless you have any final thoughts, I'm gonna wind the show down to a close.
I do not. Thank you so much for joining us, and thank you for watching our show. We really appreciate it. We're going to keep this up every week, and we hope to hear from you next week. And please comment, follow us on Twitter, send us any messages, and if you ever want to come on, please just DM us. We'll gladly bring you on.
Oh, absolutely. We're more than open to guests. But with that out of the way, thank you everyone for tuning in. Of course, share the show. Tell people you know about it, you like it. And again, just hope to see you guys next week. We will keep this up until either YouTube drives off the platform. In that case, I will find an alternative platform, or until I drop dead. So the show will go on. Is my point, and that is why I'll leave you with. That is my positive note. So see you guys next time, and goodbye.